One of the victims of the recent hurricanes that struck the southeastern part of the United States a few weeks ago was 7-year-old Micah Dry. His lifeless body was found about a quarter mile away from his home in Asheville, North Carolina. However, in the midst of such unfathomable grief, Micah's mother said this about her son, quote, "I'm so proud of my son because in his last moments, he wasn't screaming for me. He was screaming, 'Jesus, Jesus, save me. Jesus, I'm calling upon you.'" His mother continued, "Micah always wanted to be a superhero, and for me, he was. Because in his final moments, he reached for something past flesh, past human, past anything that even grown adults, I think, would reach for. My son called out to the one God Almighty, and I think at that moment, he was rescued." End quote. Where do we go? Who do we turn to when trouble and pain, even disaster, comes our way? This morning, we're looking at Psalm 46, God our refuge. And as you turn there, this psalm was written by the sons of Korah, who wrote 10 other psalms as well. Psalm 42, Psalms 44 to 45, 47 to 49, 84 and 85, and 87 and 88. And 1 Chronicles chapters 9 and 26 tell us that they were gatekeepers in the temple. But in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, we read that they were associated with those who were appointed to lead praise among the Israelites. So most likely, they were also musicians. And because the Psalms are songs, and songs are a form of poetry, as we consider the psalm this morning, we won't look at it necessarily in the order in which the verses were written, but in an order that helps us to understand and apply the main truth that the sons of Korah were expressing. The first thing that we see in this psalm is a declaration of confidence in God. In the beginning, the middle, and the end of this psalm, 3 times in this psalm, we are told that God is our refuge. And refuge literally means fortress or stronghold, a shelter in the midst of the storm. We are also told that God is our strength and that God is with us. Look at verse 1. God is our refuge and strength. Look at verse 7. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Verse 11. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Now, that's a bold statement of fact. God is our refuge. God is with us. Not that I hope God will be, or maybe if God can spare the time and energy, perhaps he can help us. No, the psalmists are in no doubt that what they are saying is true. And they are so confident about it that 3 times in the space of 11 verses, they make that same declaration. Now, not only is this God our refuge and strength, but if you look back at verse 1, the second part says, he is always ready to help us in times of trouble, a very present help in trouble. This is not, well, if you have God's number, call it and hopefully you'll get through. Or I called out to God, but since there's a few million people in front of me in line, I've been put on an extended hold. No. The sons of Korah tell us he is a very present help, meaning he is always there to help in times of trouble, to supply what we need just when we need it. Now, who exactly is this God who is our refuge, who is with us, and who is our help? Well, verses 7 and 11 tell us. How is God referred to in verse 7? The Lord of hosts. And we see that same refrain in verse 11. Literally, it means the Lord Almighty or the Lord of armies. Hosts represent God's angelic armies, emphasizing his unlimited power. The God who brought the entire universe into being with just his word, The God who can make the entire universe cease to exist with just his word, that's the God who is our refuge and strength, a help in times of trouble. But notice in verses 7 and 11, he's not only referred to as the Lord of hosts, he is also called the God of Jacob. Now, why Jacob? I mean, why not Abraham, the father of faith? After all, in times of trouble, what you need more than anything else is faith. Jacob means supplanter or deceiver, and he truly lived up to that title. If you read Jacob's story, starting from Genesis 25 onwards, he was not the ideal role model when it came to how he treated his brother, his wife, his father-in-law, or even his own sons. Yet, God chose him and used him according to God's sovereign purpose. It doesn't mean that God approved of everything Jacob did or that Jacob didn't have to suffer the consequences for his actions. In fact, Jacob's own testimony near the end of his life in Genesis 47:9 was, "Few and troublesome have been the days of the years of my life." And most of that trouble was due to Jacob's poor choices. But maybe that's why the psalmist used that term, God of Jacob. One pastor put it like this, quote, "God of Jacob reminds us of God's sovereign grace. God chose conniving Jacob so that everyone could see that he saves us on the basis of God's choice, not on the basis of our good works." The quote continues, "So you can depend on him, on God, even if you failed, if you know him as the God of Jacob. His help in a time of trouble is not conditioned on your great strength, but on his great grace," end quote. That's the declaration of confidence in God. A refuge, a shelter in the time of storm, a God who is always with us, a God who is ready to help us at our point of need. Now, secondly, what is the context or situation of this declaration? Well, not so good. Look at Psalm 46 and the second part of verse 2. "Even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea." Verse 3. "Though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling." Look at the first part of verse 6. "The nations raged, the kingdoms were moved." And the first part of verse 9, "He makes war cease to the end of the earth." This confidence in God displays itself in the worst of situations, extreme natural calamities, and extensive national conflict. Verses 2 and 3 allude to phenomena such as earthquakes or tsunamis or volcanoes. Verses 6 and 9 talk about conflicts and wars, whether within a country or between countries. In other words, this confidence in God that the psalmists are talking about is not just for those routine, everyday kind of burdens we may face. A coworker we can't seem to get along with, car trouble, struggling to keep to a budget in the face of rising costs. Now, it's not that those things are unimportant or that God does not care about our everyday struggles. No, he does. And we should turn to him no matter how small the matter may seem. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7 tells us to cast all our cares on God. But the point is, in the context of Psalm 46, the sons of Korah are telling us that even in the midst of the most horrific or tragic situation, when all we know or consider as our source of stability and safety is gone, where our very existence is uncertain, in such times, don't forget, God is our refuge. Verses 2 and 3 mention mountains. What is seemingly more stable or fixed than a mountain? And yet verse 2 says, though the mountains be carried into the sea, and verse 3 says, though the mountains shake. Verse 6 mentions kingdoms, a symbol of power and prestige. But even if mountains and kingdoms should be broken away and crumble, the psalm says, God is our strength and our safety. In Isaiah 54:10, God told his people Israel, "For the mountains shall depart and the hills be removed, but my kindness shall not depart from you, nor shall my covenant of peace be removed." That's the context of the declaration. Even if both nature and nation are collapsing, God is with us. So we have the declaration of confidence in God. We have the context or the situation in which that declaration is made. But thirdly, we also have what our response should be to this declaration of confidence in God. Psalm 46, the first part of verse 2. Therefore, we will not fear. The first response to such a declaration of confidence in God, even in the worst possible situations, is to put away fear. Now, we all know how controlling and debilitating fear can be. People will do almost anything, even irrational things, to overcome fear or not have to face their fears. But the sons of Korah are telling us here that if God is our refuge, rather than giving into fear, we need to be confident, not in ourselves, but in the God that we trust. Now, it doesn't mean that we deny terrible things around us or that we don't take normal precautions to protect ourselves. I don't wear my seatbelt. God is my refuge. No, that's not what they're saying. What it means is, even if situations go from bad to worse, and they are, we don't have to fall into a state of hopelessness or despair, because we are looking ahead to something far greater and far better than anything this world can offer us, because of what Christ has done for us. You know, when the angels announced Christ's birth to the shepherds, their first words in Luke 2:10 were, "Do not be afraid." When the angel announced Christ's resurrection to the woman at the tomb, his first words were, "Do not be afraid," Matthew 28:5. One of the reasons that Jesus came to this world and did what he did was so that people did not have to live in fear. Well, how do we know that? Well, the author of Hebrews very clearly states that in Hebrews 2:14 and 15. That through death he, that is Jesus, might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil. And look at the second part here. And release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. If God is our refuge, fear cannot, or really should not, be our master. That's what the sons of Korah are saying in Psalm 46:2. Therefore, we will not fear. The second response to the declaration of confidence in God is being in close fellowship with him. Psalm 46, verses 4 and 5. There is a river whose stream shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. God shall help her just at the break of dawn. The city of God referred to here is most likely a reference to the holy city of Jerusalem. But the river that is referred to in verse 4 is probably not literal, since Jerusalem was one of the few ancient cities that was not built on a river. Most likely the river, remember the Psalms are poetry, the river is a symbol of blessing and the presence of God, like the river of life mentioned in the New Testament in Revelation 22, verse 1. So because God was in the midst of the city, verse 5, the city would enjoy peace and protection and stability. So what's the relation to us? Well, in the same way, those who are in God's presence and in fellowship with him, even in times of trouble and calamity, they will enjoy the comfort and the peace and the blessing and stability that only God can give. Now, look at the contrast in those verses between those who are in God's presence and in fellowship with Him, as opposed to those who are away from Him. The river and the streams in verse 4 are peaceful, as opposed to the roaring waters of verses 2 and 3, the roaring waters of the sea. Verse 5 says, the city of God is secure and stable, immovable, as opposed to the mountains and the kingdoms that are quickly disappearing in verses 2 and 6. So the implication is, in those tumultuous times, we need to be close to God. The third response to the declaration of confidence in God is found in verse 8. Verse 8. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has made desolations in the earth. If we want to have no fear, if we want to be in fellowship with God, then the psalmists are telling us, the sons of Korah are telling us, we must do something. We must go to God and seek Him, seek refuge in Him. Look at the call to action in verse 8. Come and behold the works of the Lord. Now, we've already been told in the psalm that God is our refuge and that He is always ready to help us in times of trouble. But here the psalmists are reminding us that while God is always faithful to do His part, no question there, we have a responsibility to actively turn to God as our refuge. It is a willful decision on our part. But if we rebel against God or disobey what God has told us to do, how can we claim Him as our refuge? How can we claim His promises to help us? In the book of Numbers, chapter 35, we read of the cities of refuge that God appointed for His people. And just a few excerpts from this portion, beginning in verse 9. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall appoint cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the manslayer who kills any person accidentally may flee there. They shall be cities of refuge for you from the avenger, that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation in judgment. So this was God's provision for those who had committed unintentional murder. For such a person to be protected from revenge until the case was brought to trial before the congregation. Now notice, though, the person had to flee there. It says that the manslayer who kills any person accidentally may flee there. If that person did not go to one of the appointed cities, he would not be protected. Furthermore, what if at some point he decided to leave the city of refuge? Well, starting at verse 26, it says, but if the manslayer at any time goes outside the limits of the city of refuge where he fled, and the avenger of blood finds him outside the limits of his city of refuge, and the avenger of blood kills the manslayer, that avenger shall not be guilty, because he should have remained, the manslayer should have remained in his city of refuge. So God's instructions were clear. If you stayed in the appointed place of refuge, you were safe. If you left, you did so at your own risk. Going to God as our refuge and abiding in Him, what we looked at last week from Psalm 15, is a decision that we have to make. You know, we are told in God's word, for example, in Proverbs 18:10, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. But look at the second part. The righteous run to it and are safe. If I'm not running to the tower does no good for me. In the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace. We have to come to the throne of grace. And Hebrews 10:22, let us draw near with a true heart. We have to draw near. Are we going to God for refuge, or are we trying to deal with matters on our own? And that leads us to the last response mentioned in the psalm to the declaration of confidence in God, verse 10. Psalm 46, verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. Now that word be still, it's not like just when we tell a child, sit still. It doesn't just mean stop everything and pause. That could be included as part of the idea, but literally the word is cease from striving or stop your fighting. And if we go back to the verse just before in verse 9, it's obviously a reference to the nations who are in conflict either within the nation or between nations, the nations who are warring against each other. This also reminds us of the events of Exodus 14, as Pharaoh's army was pursuing the Israelites and they came to the Red Sea. The people were seemingly trapped with no escape. They started speaking out against Moses. And what did Moses tell them? Do not be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. So literally, stop fretting. Stop being anxious for something that you have no control over. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. So the idea is stop trying all your futile human methods to achieve peace and victory. The satisfaction and the blessing you are looking for come only from one source. So what should we do instead? Well, the second part of the verse tells us, Psalm 46:10, the only way that peace and blessing come is by people acknowledging who God is. Second part of verse 10, I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. If we know God's character and his power and his sovereign control over all things, we will realize it is vain to try to take matters into our own hands. And the verse reminds us that if people will humble themselves before the Lord and give him the honor and the glory that he deserves, then he will work on their behalf. This morning, many questions come to the forefront as we think about what the sons of Korah have written here in Psalm 46. Where is our confidence in times of trouble, especially extreme trouble? That's the context of this psalm. Extreme trouble, calamity, tragedy. One pastor writes, quote, it's so easy to build up our own defenses against trouble and to put our trust in them instead of in God. We trust in our bank accounts, our insurance policies, our schemes and plans for the future. There is nothing wrong with these things. In fact, the Bible urges us to be prudent in planning for the future. But those things can become wrong if we allow them to shift our trust from God alone. End quote. If we really believe that even in the worst possible situation that God is our refuge, are we going to let fear determine how we think and act, or are we going to be confident, again, not in ourselves, but in the God that we trust? In times of trouble, calamity, do we draw near to God and go to him as our refuge to find comfort and strength? Or do we, in anger, frustration, and disappointment with what is happening to us or around us, blame God and accuse him as if God owes us anything better? Do we live in rebellion and disobedience to him in such times? How do we draw near to God? Well, we draw near to God by communing with him through prayer and through his word, by meeting together with his people for fellowship and worship, by faithfully serving him through the responsibilities he gives us. And when things around us are falling apart, do we try to take matters into our own hands, trusting our human wisdom, or do we cease from our striving and acknowledge that God is in control and that he has a purpose in all that he allows? And that ultimately, as verse 10 says, he will be exalted, he will be glorified, not just in our situation, but what does it say there? I will be exalted among the nations in the earth. This psalm gives us a powerful reminder that there are many things that are beyond our control. And instead of being anxious for those things, we need to be faithful with what God has entrusted to us. And the two specific situations mentioned in the context of this psalm, natural calamities and national conflict, those are things that not just around the world, but our very country is going through at this moment. So the question comes to us, where or to whom are we looking for answers? Romanian-American writer Elie Wiesel, whose writings have focused on the Jewish Holocaust, himself was imprisoned by the Nazis at the age of 16. And while in the concentration camps of Buchenwald and Auschwitz, he underwent tremendous, unspeakable suffering and torture. And in one of his writings, he mentions a particular incident that lives in his memory forever. 3 people in whose possession weapons were found were sentenced to death by hanging. 2 of them were adults. But what made this incident different was the third one was just a child. And as the 3 condemned prisoners, stepped onto chairs and the nooses were placed around their necks, Wiesel said someone behind him was asking, where is merciful God now? Where is he? At the guard signal, the chairs were tipped over and the 2 adult men instantly died. But the child, his body being so light, was still breathing. And Wiesel writes, quote, and so he remained for more than half an hour, lingering between life and death, writhing before our eyes, end quote. And Wiesel and all the rest of the prisoners were made to watch this entire spectacle. And behind me, Wiesel says, I heard the same man asking, where is God now? Where is God now? Yet, as they walked back to their prison quarters, he said he heard one of the prisoners reciting this portion from what they would say the Torah, Deuteronomy 33. And that's what I would like to read in closing. Turn there, if you would, Deuteronomy 33. God forbid that we ever have to experience such atrocity. But if God cannot be a refuge in the worst possible situation, then what kind of a refuge is he really? Deuteronomy 33, verse 26. And of course, in context, this was given as a blessing to the sons of Jacob, but as God's children today, these promises of God's protection and deliverance apply to us as well. Deuteronomy 33, 26. There is no one like the God of Jeshurun, who rides the heavens to help you, and in his excellency on the clouds. The eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. He will thrust out the enemy from before you, and I will say, destroy. Then Israel shall dwell in safety, the fountain of Jacob alone. In the land of grain and new wine, his heavens shall also drop dew. Verse 29, happy are you, O Israel. Who is like you, a people saved by the Lord?
And even when it feels like he may not be there, he will never leave us nor forsake us.
Amen.